They didn't just make noise. They turned my peaceful backyard into a nightclub, and for a while I honestly thought I was the only person in the neighborhood who still remembered what quiet felt like. I bought my townhouse because it was the one place where I could come home after a long day, close the gate behind me, and hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees. I never expected that the biggest fight of my life would start with a pair of speakers sitting 30 feet away from my bedroom window. My name is Daniel Parker, and for almost 9 years I lived in a small community called Willow Creek Estates outside of Portland, Oregon. It wasn't some luxury neighborhood with giant houses and fancy gates. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other when they passed, where everyone knew whose dog escaped and who grew tomatoes in their backyard. My townhouse sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the last building before a line of tall cedar trees that separated us from the main road. It was a simple 3-story brick home. Nothing flashy, but I loved it. I had built a little garden behind the house myself, planted shrubs along the fence, added stone paths, and spent countless evenings sitting outside with a cup of coffee watching the sun disappear. That was the whole reason I chose that place. Privacy, peace, a little corner of the world that felt like mine. After years of working in construction management, dealing with deadlines, contractors, and people arguing over every little detail, I wanted my home to be the one place where nobody was demanding anything from me. And for years, it was exactly that. My evenings were quiet. I would cook dinner, water the plants, maybe read a book outside while the neighborhood slowly settled down. The loudest thing I heard most nights was the sound of sprinklers turning on or the occasional owl somewhere in the trees. Then the house next door went up for sale. At first, I was actually excited. A new neighbor could be great. Maybe someone who enjoyed the same quiet lifestyle. Maybe someone who would become a friend. Then one afternoon, I saw 2 moving trucks pull up, and that's when I met Mason Reed and Chloe Bennett. They were young, successful, and the kind of people who walked into a room like they already owned it. Mason worked in software development. Chloe ran some kind of online marketing company, and together they had this energy that was impossible to ignore. They weren't rude when they first arrived. Actually, they were incredibly friendly. They brought over a bottle of wine, introduced themselves, and told me they were excited to bring some life into the neighborhood. I remember laughing because at the time I thought it was just one of those harmless phrases people say when they move somewhere new. I had no idea how accurate those words would become. Within a few months, their backyard started changing. Then their rooftop started changing. They installed a rooftop entertainment area with metal railings, a built-in bar, decorative lighting, and a massive outdoor speaker system that looked more appropriate for a restaurant patio than a residential neighborhood. I watched it happen piece by piece from my kitchen window, and I kept telling myself not to overreact. People were allowed to enjoy their homes. People were allowed to have friends over. I wasn't some old guy yelling at kids to get off his lawn. I wasn't trying to stop anyone from having fun, but there was a difference between living your life and making everyone around you live it with you. The first time I talked to Mason about it, he leaned over the shared fence with a big smile on his face and said, "Hey Daniel, hope you don't mind a little energy next door. We just believe life is too short to stay quiet." I smiled back because honestly, I didn't want to fight. I just said, "I don't mind people having fun, but I do hope we can keep things reasonable, especially late at night." Mason laughed like I had made a joke. "Of course, man. We're not trying to bother anybody." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that Friday night, around 10:30, the first party started. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it would end soon. The music got louder, then louder again. The bass started traveling through the walls of my house, vibrating through my windows like someone had placed a subwoofer inside my living room. I walked upstairs and looked outside. Under the blue lights on their rooftop, I could see people dancing, laughing, holding drinks, completely unaware that 3 other homes around them had already gone dark. I stood there for a moment, watching, and I remember thinking, this is going to become a problem, because deep down, I already knew something had changed. My quiet little corner wasn't quiet anymore. And the people next door didn't seem to understand that a neighborhood was supposed to be shared space, not a private party venue. The next morning, I decided to handle it the right way. I walked over, knocked on their door, and tried to keep the conversation calm. Chloe answered wearing sunglasses, holding a coffee cup, looking like she had just stepped out of a vacation photo. I explained that the music had gone past midnight and asked if they could lower the volume after 10. She smiled politely and said, "Daniel, we're just being social." The Homeowners Association actually loves when residents create community. That sentence stuck with me because it wasn't really an apology. It was a reminder that they believed they had permission, and I was about to learn that when someone thinks the rules don't apply to them, asking nicely is usually the first thing they ignore. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself that the problem would solve itself. Maybe they would get tired of the parties. Maybe they would realize that the people around them weren't enjoying the noise as much as they were. Maybe the HOA would finally understand that there was a difference between creating a community and disturbing one. But none of that happened. In fact, things only got worse. After Chloe told me the HOA supported their community energy, Mason and Chloe seemed even more comfortable pushing the limits. The parties became bigger. The nights became longer. What started as a weekend gathering turned into something that felt like a regular event. Thursday nights, Friday nights, sometimes even Sunday evenings. I would sit at my kitchen table trying to eat dinner while the bass from next door made the silverware shake against the plate. It was a strange feeling, because I wasn't angry all the time. That might sound surprising, but I wasn't. Mostly, I was disappointed. I kept thinking about how easily this could have been avoided. I wasn't asking them to stop living their lives. I wasn't asking them to remove the rooftop deck or never invite friends over again. I was asking for something incredibly simple, consideration. But somehow, even that felt like too much to ask. Then came the night I realized this wasn't just about noise anymore. It was about respect. I came home after working late one evening, exhausted and ready to sit outside for a few minutes before going to bed. The second I opened my backyard gate, I saw something that made my stomach drop. My garden was covered with tiny pieces of glitter, crushed plastic cups, and food wrappers. My carefully maintained flower beds looked like someone had used them as a party cleanup zone. At first, I just stood there quietly. I didn't yell. I didn't storm next door. I didn't even flee angry right away. I just felt tired. I remember looking at the plants I had spent years growing and thinking, how did we get here? The next morning, I took pictures. Every piece of trash, every mark on the garden wall, every detail. Then I sent everything to the HOA. I wasn't expecting them to punish anyone. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted someone to acknowledge that this wasn't normal. Their response came later that afternoon. It was polite, professional, and completely useless. They wrote that communities require flexibility and understanding between neighbors. I read that sentence 3 times because I honestly couldn't believe it. Flexibility, understanding. Somehow, the person throwing the parties every week wasn't being asked to adjust, but the person cleaning up after them was being asked to be more understanding. A few minutes later, I received a message from Mason. He had forwarded me an invitation to their next rooftop party. There was a little laughing emoji at the end. I stared at that message for a long time. I think that was the moment something changed in me. Not anger, not rage, just clarity. I realized I had been trying to win an argument that they weren't interested in having. They didn't see me as a neighbor with a legitimate concern. They saw me as an obstacle. So I stopped talking and started documenting. Every weekend, I recorded the time the music started. I recorded when it ended. I filmed the number of guests arriving. I saved every message. I downloaded the decibel meter app and began keeping notes. It wasn't exciting work. Honestly, it was boring. But I knew something about problems like this. Feelings disappear, but records don't. After a few weeks, I decided I needed more than phone measurements. I contacted an acoustic specialist named Rachel Monroe, someone who worked with homeowners and businesses dealing with sound complaints. She came by one evening without telling Mason or Chloe. She walked through my house, stood in the backyard, and measured the sound from different locations. She didn't say much during the test. She just listened. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Daniel, this isn't just annoying. This is excessive." Her report confirmed what I already knew. The noise coming from the rooftop speakers was above the city's residential limits by 12 decibels. That number might not sound like much, but in sound measurement, it was a significant difference. It explained why I could feel the bass inside my home even when the windows were closed. With the report in hand, I filed a formal complaint with the city's code enforcement office. I still remember the day the inspector arrived. He didn't come with flashing lights or make a scene. He parked several houses away, sat quietly in his vehicle, and listened for nearly 20 minutes. He just documented what was happening. The music was pounding. People were shouting. The entire street could hear it. Before he left, he looked at me and said, "This should be pretty straightforward." For the first time in months, I felt like someone else finally understood what I had been dealing with. But Mason wasn't worried. A few days later, he walked outside and told another neighbor that they had already handled everything. He said they had installed soundproofing materials around the rooftop deck and that the city would never have a problem with it. He said it with that same confidence he always had. Like every situation was something money and charm could fix. But then the official notice arrived, and when Mason opened that envelope, the expression on his face changed completely. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a violation notice. The city had determined that the rooftop speakers were in violation of local noise regulations, and the fine was $500 per day until the issue was corrected. Suddenly, the party that everyone thought would last forever had an expiration date, and for the first time, Mason and Chloe had to deal with something they couldn't simply talk their way out of. When Mason and Chloe opened that violation notice, I don't think they truly believed it was real at first. For months, they had operated under the assumption that being confident enough could solve any problem. They were successful people. They were used to getting meetings, making deals, convincing people, and walking away with what they wanted. In their world, a problem was usually just something that needed a better presentation or the right person to explain it away. But this wasn't a business negotiation. This was a neighborhood. And for the first time, they were dealing with something that couldn't be charmed into disappearing. I remember seeing Mason standing on his rooftop the evening after the notice arrived. The same rooftop that used to glow blue every weekend was completely dark. No music, no guests, no laughter. He was just standing there looking down at the street, and for a brief moment, I almost felt bad for him, because underneath all the frustration, I could see something I hadn't seen before. He was realizing that he had miscalculated. The thing he thought made him powerful was actually the thing that had isolated him. His confidence had turned into arrogance, and his idea of bringing people together had pushed people away. But instead of accepting that, Mason and Chloe decided to fight the violation. They hired an attorney and filed an appeal, claiming the city was unfairly targeting them. Their argument was that the rooftop gatherings were part of their lifestyle, their way of expressing themselves, and their way of creating a social environment in the community. When I heard that, I honestly had to sit down for a minute because it was such a strange way to frame the situation. Nobody had taken away their ability to have friends over. Nobody had told them they couldn't enjoy their home. Nobody had told them they couldn't celebrate birthdays, holidays, or special moments. The only thing anyone asked was simple: keep the noise at a level where other people could still live their own lives. But somehow, that basic request had become, in their minds, a personal attack. During the appeal process, the neighborhood changed. Not dramatically, not in some big public way, but quietly. People who had once smiled and waved at Mason and Chloe started keeping conversations shorter. Some neighbors admitted they had also been bothered by the parties, but didn't want to be the first ones to complain. That was something I never expected. For months, I thought I was the only person fighting this battle. I thought everyone else was either okay with it or too afraid to say anything. But I learned that sometimes silence doesn't mean agreement. Sometimes people are just waiting to see if someone else has the courage to speak first. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived 3 houses down, stopped me one morning while I was checking my mail. He said, Daniel, I thought I was just getting old because I couldn't sleep anymore. Turns out I was just tired of hearing a nightclub outside my bedroom. We both laughed, and honestly, that was probably the first time in months that the whole situation felt a little less heavy, because sometimes humor is the only thing that keeps you sane when you're dealing with something ridiculous. A few weeks later, the city's final decision came in. The appeal was denied. The ruling was clear. Mason and Chloe had every right to enjoy their property, but they did not have the right to create a disturbance that affected everyone around them. They were given a final deadline to remove the speakers or face continued penalties. When I read the decision, I didn't feel the excitement I expected. I didn't feel like I had won some kind of victory. There was no satisfaction in watching another person lose. What I felt was relief, real relief, because the truth is, fighting the situation had drained me. People often imagine these kinds of conflicts as dramatic battles where one side wins and the other side loses, but the reality is much more exhausting. It was emails, documentation, waiting, doubting yourself, wondering if maybe you were being unreasonable, wondering if peace was worth the effort. There were nights when I sat in my kitchen looking at the paperwork and thought, is this really what my life has become? I didn't want to spend my evenings fighting with my neighbors. I wanted to spend them enjoying my home. The morning the speakers were finally removed, I woke up before my alarm. I think part of me knew it was happening. I made coffee, stood by my upstairs window, and watched the scene unfold. A small city crew arrived quietly. No drama, no police cars, no angry confrontation, just professionals doing exactly what they were supposed to do. They walked onto the property, inspected the equipment, and began carefully disconnecting the speakers. The same speakers that had caused months of arguments, sleepless nights, and tension between neighbors were removed in less than an hour. Funny how something that creates such a huge problem can disappear so quickly once someone finally decides to address it. Mason stood on the rooftop watching the entire process. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just stood there with his arms crossed, looking frustrated and defeated. Chloe stayed inside most of the time. Maybe she was embarrassed. Maybe she was angry. Maybe she was just tired of fighting. I don't know. And honestly, I didn't need to know, because when those speakers left, the entire street seemed to breathe again. That night, I went outside and sat in my garden. The same garden that had been covered in trash months earlier. The same place where I used to sit before all of this started. The air felt different. The quiet felt different. I could hear the wind moving through the cedar trees. I could hear birds in the distance. I could hear absolutely nothing from the house next door, and that nothing felt incredible. A few days later, Mason confronted me near the mailbox. He wasn't shouting, but I could tell he was still angry. He looked at me and said, Daniel, you really didn't have to go this far. I looked at him and thought about everything that had happened. The conversations, the requests, the messages, the reports, all the moments where I had tried to handle things peacefully. So I simply said, Mason, I didn't go anywhere. I asked you to be considerate. The city asked you to follow the rules. That's the only thing that happened. He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked away and walked back toward his house. And that was the last serious conversation we ever had. Over the next few months, things slowly returned to normal. The rooftop remained empty. The neighborhood became quieter. People started spending time outside again. Children played in the street. Neighbors talked longer when they met at the mailbox. It was almost like everyone had been waiting for permission to relax again. But I know some people watching this story will disagree with me. And honestly, I understand why. Some people might say I should have been more patient, that neighbors need to tolerate each other's differences, that communities are built on compromise. And they are right about that. Compromise matters. Patience matters. Understanding matters. But I also believe compromise only works when both sides are willing to participate. A neighborhood cannot function if one person gets to enjoy their freedom by taking away someone else's peace. Home is supposed to be the one place where you can close the door and feel comfortable. It shouldn't feel like you're competing with the person next door for control over your own life. Looking back now, I don't remember the loud music as much as I remember the lesson. I learned that staying calm doesn't mean you are powerless. Being polite doesn't mean you have to accept being ignored. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is not the person who lost the argument. Sometimes they're just the person who is patient enough to wait until the facts spoke for themselves. So now I want to hear what you think. Was I right to take the issue through official channels? Or should I have handled things differently? At what point does being a good neighbor stop meaning tolerating someone's behavior? Where do you think the line should be between personal freedom and respect for the people around you? Leave your opinion in the comments because I know this is the kind of situation where reasonable people can see both sides. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who pushed things too far, share your story too. Someone watching this might be going through the exact same thing right now and wondering if they're alone. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes that peace at home is something worth protecting.